In the last stage of interviews for a senior strategy position at Ashford Industries, billionaire Margaret Ellison didn't even glance at the resume placed in front of her. She pushed it to one side without a second look, and her senior director shoved it further away, all the way to the table's edge, almost as if the man who'd submitted it had no business being there. That man was Marcus Reed, a black single father dressed in a worn gray suit, sitting quietly at the far end of the table while two polished contenders competed for a decision worth $4 billion. When Margaret finally posed the one question that mattered most, both of her preferred candidates faltered. Marcus responded with a single line that froze the entire boardroom. What did this overlooked father say that made a room full of executives realize they'd misjudged him from the very first handshake? Before diving in, if stories like this keep you watching until the end, consider subscribing. It helps this channel keep bringing you more. The early morning light through the kitchen window was still dim when Marcus Reed knelt to fix his daughter's hair. Zoe sat on a stool, swinging her feet, watching him in the small mirror propped against the toaster. He gathered her curls into two sections and secured them with the blue bands she loved, the ones with tiny star charms. "You're gonna be late," Zoe said, though she didn't sound concerned. "I've got time," Marcus replied, smoothing a loose curl near her temple. "Finish your cereal, and don't forget your library books are due today. I'll pick you up right after school, promise." Zoe nodded, already reaching for her spoon, and Marcus stood to look at himself in that same small mirror. The gray suit reflected back hadn't changed in 6 years, though he certainly had. It still fit across the shoulders, still pressed neatly along the collar, but it belonged to an earlier version of himself, one who once walked into boardrooms without hesitation. That version of Marcus had been a strategy consultant with his own office and a schedule full of executives seeking his input before major decisions. Then his marriage ended, and custody of Zoe became more important than any title. He traded stability for flexibility, taking small consulting jobs that let him be home for dinner, home for bedtime, home for the moments a young child needed most. 6 years later, those jobs had thinned to occasional work, and the bills had piled higher than his patience for waiting. When a recruiter called about an opening at Ashford Industries, Marcus nearly declined, certain a company that size wouldn't look twice at a resume with a 6-year gap. But he said yes anyway, because refusing meant nothing would change, and something had to change for Zoe's sake. His single-page resume contained everything he believed mattered, not because he lacked experience, but because Marcus trusted that results spoke louder than length. 3 companies he'd personally saved from bankruptcy were listed in a few clean lines, backed by numbers to prove it. He tucked the page into his briefcase, kissed Zoe's forehead, and stepped into a city unaware of what was about to unfold inside one of its tallest buildings. Ashford Industries occupied 40 floors of glass and steel in the financial district, a company Margaret Ellison had built from a single manufacturing patent into a diversified empire worth billions. She was known for being sharper than most of the men who'd once underestimated her, and for assembling teams that matched her own demanding standards. But even her instincts had limits, and those limits were now costing her company dearly. At the center of it all sat a project called Horizon, a $4 billion initiative that had been losing money for nearly 3 years straight. Every internal report blamed the market, competitors, the economy, anything but the strategy itself. Margaret needed someone to walk into that mess and tell her the truth, which was exactly why she was hiring a new chief strategy officer that week, and why the final round had narrowed to 3 names. Bradley Stone was the type of candidate who commanded a room before he even spoke. He came from one of the country's top consulting firms, the kind of pedigree that opened doors before anyone read his resume. Bradley spoke in confident, polished phrases full of market frameworks and industry benchmarks, the language of someone who'd never doubted his worth in a room like this. Samuel Ortiz carried himself differently. Where Bradley projected certainty, Samuel observed first and spoke second, shaped by years in operations and turnarounds rather than boardroom theory. He listened more than he talked, and when he did speak, his words landed with precision rather than volume. Samuel was quieter competition, but competition nonetheless, and he knew it. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, badge in hand, briefcase under his arm. The receptionist glanced up, then back at her screen, then up again with a slight furrow in her brow. "Are you here for a delivery?" she asked. "Or IT support I should direct to another floor?" "I'm here for the Chief Strategy Officer interview," Marcus said evenly. Marcus Reed, 9 o'clock with Ms. Ellison. Her eyes swept over his suit, his briefcase, his face, before she finally checked her list and found his name. She printed his badge silently, though the suspicion in her expression lingered longer than necessary, long enough for Marcus to feel it settle in his chest like a weight he'd carried before. The elevator ride to the 40th floor gave him time to steady himself, and by the time the doors opened onto the executive boardroom, his expression had returned to something calm and unreadable. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined one wall, showing the city below like a map of everything Horizon was meant to conquer and hadn't. Bradley and Samuel were already seated, both dressed in suits that looked freshly tailored. Margaret Ellison stood near the head of the table, sharp-eyed and composed, flanked by Gordon Pierce, her senior director of strategy, and two other executives Marcus would only later learn the names of. Margaret crossed the room to shake Bradley's hand, asking about his recent work with a logistics client, her tone genuinely engaged. She did the same with Samuel, asking a pointed question about a turnaround he'd led the previous year, nodding with real interest at his response. When she reached Marcus, she offered only a brief nod, her gaze skimming his suit for half a second before returning to the folder in her hand. "Mr. Reed," she said simply, gesturing to the empty seat at the far end. Marcus placed his single-page resume on the table in front of her, just as he had for every interview that mattered. Margaret glanced at it, then set it aside without opening it, sliding it beneath a thicker stack of documents. It was a small gesture, but Marcus felt it land exactly as intended. Gordon Pierce, seated to her right, reached over and nudged the resume further aside, closer to the table's edge, as though clearing space for something more important. He didn't look at Marcus while doing it, which somehow made the gesture feel more deliberate. Samuel, however, glanced down at the folder as it moved, his eyes catching briefly on the logo at the top of the page, a small logistics company he vaguely recalled reading about in an industry newsletter, one that had gone from near collapse to a featured case study almost overnight. He said nothing, but a flicker of curiosity crossed his face before he looked back toward the front of the room. The meeting opened the way most of these meetings did, with introductions and a summary of Horizon's numbers projected on the screen behind Margaret. 11 consecutive quarters of losses scrolled past in red, a $4 billion initiative that had once been the company's proudest bet and was now its heaviest liability. Bradley leaned forward eagerly, anticipating his chance to shine. When the floor opened for questions, he spoke first, unprompted, offering a sweeping analysis of macroeconomic pressures and shifting consumer demand. His delivery was smooth and rehearsed, the kind that came from giving this exact presentation many times before. Margaret listened, nodding occasionally, though her expression revealed little of what she actually thought. Samuel followed with a more grounded response, focusing on operational inefficiencies and a proposed restructuring timeline. His answer carried more weight than Bradley's, built from real experience rather than theory, and several executives nodded along as he spoke. Marcus listened closely to both, aware that neither man had said anything false, but neither had explained the real problem either. Every time he opened his mouth to add something, the conversation shifted direction before he could finish, redirected toward Bradley or Samuel by Gordon or another executive. It happened 3 times in a row, each time subtle enough that no one else seemed to notice, though Marcus noticed every one. Then Margaret set down her pen and looked directly down the table, her question aimed at all 3 candidates at once. If Horizon has a strong product, real demand, competitive pricing, and a capable team, she said, why has it lost money for 11 straight quarters? The room fell quiet before Bradley answered first, citing shifting market conditions and increased competition from 2 rival firms that had entered the space over the past 2 years. It was a confident answer delivered without hesitation, but it explained everything the company already knew and nothing it didn't. Margaret's expression didn't change. Samuel answered next, proposing a restructuring plan that would cut costs across 3 departments and streamline sales within 6 months. It was more actionable than Bradley's answer, grounded in operational detail, but it addressed the symptoms rather than the underlying cause. Margaret glanced toward the end of the table, where Marcus had yet to speak. He had spent the previous night reading through the 140-page internal report emailed to all 3 candidates. Buried in a data table on page 92, he found something none of the internal analysts seemed to have connected to anything else in the document, a detail that reframed everything the company believed about Horizon's failure. He sat with that knowledge now, weighing 2 paths. Staying silent meant avoiding the risk of outright dismissal by a room that had already decided he didn't belong. Speaking meant challenging 3 years of strategy built by the very people across the table from him, including the man who'd just pushed his resume aside unread. Marcus thought of Zoe waiting for him after school, of the blue bands in her hair, of every quiet promise he'd made to give her something more stable than what they had now. He thought of every company he'd turned around by telling clients the truth they didn't want to hear, and how none of those turnarounds had ever begun with silence. "The problem isn't outside the market," Marcus said, his voice even and unhurried, cutting cleanly through the room for the first time since he'd walked in. "The problem is inside an assumption this room has believed for 3 years." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward until every eye turned toward the man at the end of the table, whose resume still sat forgotten beneath a stack no one had opened. Gordon Pierce let out a short laugh, meant to shrink the room rather than fill it. He set down his pen and looked at Marcus with the practiced condescension of someone who'd spent decades deciding whose opinions mattered in that building. "A 1-page resume doesn't give you standing to overturn 3 years of analysis from this entire leadership team," Gordon said, glancing around for support. "We've spent $40 million on outside consulting for this project. Are you suggesting a freelance strategist saw something all of them missed?" Bradley leaned back, a faint smile crossing his face, as though Marcus had just eliminated himself from consideration. Samuel, on the other hand, leaned forward slightly, his earlier curiosity sharpening into genuine attention. He said nothing, but his eyes stayed fixed on Marcus rather than Gordon. Margaret studied Marcus for a long moment before speaking, her voice even and unreadable. "If you believe everyone in this room has been wrong," she said, "you'll need to prove it right now. No slides, no preparation, just the data already in that report." Beside her, the chief financial officer exchanged a quick glance with the executive next to him, the kind of look that needed no words to convey skepticism. It was subtle, but it told Marcus exactly how many people in that room had already decided he had nothing worth hearing. Marcus stood and asked permission to pull up the customer revenue breakdown from the report's appendix, the section most people had likely skimmed past on their way to the executive summary. Gordon gestured toward the screen impatiently, expecting to be proven right within 30 seconds. The chart Marcus displayed showed Horizon's revenue broken down by customer segment across the past 11 quarters. He pointed to the line representing large enterprise accounts, the segment the entire strategy had been built around, then to the line beside it, representing mid-sized companies the strategy had never prioritized. "Every projection in this report assumes growth will come from large enterprise clients," Marcus said. "But look at where the actual revenue has come from. Nearly 70% of Horizon's income over the past 11 quarters has come from mid-sized companies, not the enterprise accounts this strategy was built to chase." A woman near the far end, one of the regional vice presidents, leaned forward and asked whether that pattern might simply reflect short-term fluctuation rather than something structural. It was a fair question asked without hostility, and Marcus answered it directly rather than defensively. "If it were fluctuation, the pattern would shift quarter to quarter," he said. "But it hasn't. It's held steady this entire time, which means it isn't noise, it's the actual shape of demand this product has found, whether the strategy acknowledges it or not." Bradley tried to counter with a broader point about enterprise clients representing the larger addressable market in theory, the kind of argument that sounds compelling until it meets the numbers directly. Marcus acknowledged the theory calmly before turning back to the screen. "That's true on paper," he said. But this room isn't looking at paper. It's looking at nearly 3 years of real revenue, and the market on paper isn't the one paying the bills. For the first time since the meeting began, Samuel leaned forward and asked a question of his own, aimed directly at Marcus rather than defending his earlier answer. He asked what specifically in the mid-market segment had allowed it to grow steadily while the enterprise segment stagnated, a question rooted in genuine curiosity rather than performance. Marcus walked through the retention numbers for mid-sized clients, showing how their renewal rates had stayed consistently higher than enterprise accounts, even without the dedicated support and pricing structure reserved for the largest customers. The room had gone quiet in a different way now, the quiet of people actually listening. "You're trying to sell Horizon to customers the model imagined," Marcus said, looking around the table rather than at any one person, while ignoring the customers the revenue has already proven. The sentence settled over the room heavier than anything said before it. Margaret's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the look of someone recalculating everything she thought she understood. Marcus was no longer the candidate nobody had bothered to properly introduce. He'd become the only person in the room who seemed to see the actual shape of the problem. Gordon's composure cracked first, because the model Marcus had just dismantled was the one his own department had built 3 years earlier. If Marcus was right, it meant Gordon had personally overseen billions in misallocated strategy, and that wasn't something he was prepared to accept in front of Margaret. He came back harder, firing off one question after another without waiting for full answers: what it would cost to shift the entire strategy toward mid-market clients, how enterprise accounts would react to being deprioritized, whether profit margins on mid-size deals could sustain the company at its current scale, and who would be held responsible if the shift failed. Marcus answered each in turn, working through rough calculations aloud rather than retreating into vague reassurance. When he reached a question the current data genuinely couldn't answer, he said so plainly, admitting the limits of what he could conclude without additional numbers he didn't yet have. Gordon seized on that admission immediately, standing up as though he'd finally found the opening he needed. "This man read 140 pages overnight and is asking us to gamble a $4 billion project on a hunch," he said, turning to Margaret directly. "He has no recent corporate experience, no current standing in this industry, and by his own admission, gaps in his analysis. I'd suggest we stop wasting this council's time and move to a decision between the two qualified candidates in this room." The words hit hard enough to pull the air out of the room for a moment. Bradley straightened in his chair, clearly hoping the demand would land. Samuel didn't react at all, his eyes still fixed on Marcus, waiting to see how he'd answer a challenge aimed not at his data, but at his right to be sitting there at all. Marcus didn't raise his voice. "I never claimed to have every answer today," he said, looking at Gordon directly. "What I claimed is that the assumption underneath this entire project is wrong, and the numbers back that up. Being honest about what I don't know yet isn't a weakness in this room, it's the one thing nobody else has done all morning." Margaret raised a hand before Gordon could respond, her eyes still on Marcus. That honesty seemed to catch her attention more than anything he'd said so far. Neither Bradley nor Samuel had shown that same willingness to admit uncertainty, both had projected confidence even in moments where it wasn't fully earned. Marcus's willingness to say, "I don't know yet," even with Gordon demanding his removal, stood out precisely because it was so rare in that room. Gordon shifted tactics again, moving from the numbers to Marcus himself, the 6 years away from corporate strategy work, the worn suit, the single-page resume, the absence of a recent degree or a recognizable firm behind his name, listing each detail like evidence in a case against him. Margaret finally opened the folder that had sat untouched beneath her paperwork since the meeting began. She read through it slowly this time, her eyes moving over each line with an attention she hadn't given it earlier. Inside that single page were results she hadn't expected. One company had cut its operating costs by 41% under Marcus's guidance. A manufacturing plant on the brink of bankruptcy had returned to profitability within a year. A technology division he'd once restructured had become a case study taught in business programs, though his own name never appeared in the credit. Margaret realized she had judged the resume far too quickly that morning and had never actually taken the time to read the person behind it. It was a small, private moment of recognition, but it changed how she viewed Marcus for the rest of the meeting. Samuel spoke again, this time without hesitation, addressing the room rather than just Marcus. He said plainly that Marcus's presentation had been more rigorous than his own, built on evidence rather than assumption, and that he had no interest in pretending otherwise just to protect his own position. It was a small admission, but it marked a clear shift in how Samuel carried himself for the rest of the meeting, no longer competing against Marcus, but recognizing what he'd actually found. Bradley said nothing in response, though his earlier confidence had visibly thinned. Despite everything Marcus had proven, the room didn't settle into agreement the way the moment seemed to promise. Several executives exchanged quiet glances, still inclined toward the safer, more familiar choice of either Bradley or Samuel. Choosing Marcus meant admitting that the hiring process itself, along with 3 years of leadership decisions, had been built on a flawed foundation from the start. Marcus understood exactly what that silence meant. He closed the folder in front of him and set his hands flat on the table, quietly preparing for the possibility that none of this would matter in the end. He'd told them the truth, shown them exactly where their strategy had gone wrong, and it still might not be enough to change how this room saw him. For a brief moment, he thought of Zoe waiting for him after school, the promise he'd made that morning to be on time, the blue band still fresh in her hair when he'd left the apartment. The thought didn't weaken him, it reminded him why silence had never been the right choice. Margaret rose from her seat, and the room turned toward her immediately. She looked down the table at Marcus, her expression harder to read now than at any point that morning, and asked the one question that would decide everything that followed. "If you had only one answer left to prove you're the right person for this room," she said, "what would you say?" No one moved. Bradley sat frozen, pen still resting on his notepad. Samuel watched Marcus with quiet attention, waiting the way someone waits for the last piece of a puzzle to fall into place. Whatever Marcus said next would either end his chances entirely or change everything that had happened in that room since he first walked through the door. Marcus sat at the far end with every eye fixed on him, the woman who had once pushed his resume aside now waiting for his answer as though nothing else in the building mattered. There was no time for long explanations, no room for another slide or data table. Whatever he said next had to carry the weight of everything he'd proven so far in a single sentence. His mind drifted briefly to the 6 years since he'd walked away from a corporate title to raise Zoe on his own, the quiet apartment, the nights he worked long after she'd fallen asleep, the small companies he'd helped save simply by forcing their owners to face the truth instead of protecting their pride. None of that had ever required a title. It had only required honesty. He looked directly at Margaret, his voice steady in a way that filled the silence without needing to rise above it. "Ashford Industries has to stop trying to save the company you once planned for," Marcus said, "and start running the company you actually have." The sentence landed and settled over the room like something physical. It wasn't simply an answer about Horizon's failure, it exposed the deeper pattern running through the entire company, the tendency to defend an old plan long after the evidence had moved on without it. Nobody spoke for a long moment because nobody needed to. The truth was already sitting in front of them, plain and undeniable. The chief financial officer was the first to break the silence, his expression shifting as pieces he'd never connected finally clicked into place. He admitted quietly that this explained why every quarterly forecast for Horizon had missed its mark so consistently, no matter how many times the model had been adjusted by his own team. The regional vice president spoke next, recalling data from mid-sized client accounts that had crossed her desk months earlier and had simply been filed away without much thought. She said she remembered flagging the pattern once briefly before moving on to other priorities that seemed more urgent at the time. Samuel spoke without waiting to be asked, addressing the room in a tone free of defensiveness. He said plainly that Marcus had seen something he himself had missed entirely, despite months of work on the same project, and that pretending otherwise would only be a disservice to everyone at the table. Bradley followed a moment later, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to quiet respect. He acknowledged that his own presentation had only described the symptoms of Horizon's decline, while Marcus had actually identified the cause hiding beneath them. It wasn't easy for him to admit, but he said it clearly enough for the whole room to hear. Margaret remained standing at the head of the table, looking at Marcus with an expression that had shifted entirely from where it started that morning. She set down the folder she'd been holding and spoke without any of the coldness that had colored her first greeting to him. "I looked at your suit," she said, "and I looked at your one-page resume, and I decided you were the least important person in this room. Today, you proved you're the only one who actually understood the company I built." The apology carried none of the polish Bradley or Samuel might have used if the roles were reversed. It was direct, almost bare, the words of someone who'd built an empire on sharp instincts and was now admitting in front of her own leadership team that those instincts had failed her that morning. Marcus accepted it with a simple nod, nothing more. Margaret turned to the rest of the table and announced her decision without further deliberation. Marcus Reed would become the new Chief Strategy Officer of Ashford Industries, with full authority over the Horizon project moving forward. The words landed with a finality that left no room for objection, not even from Gordon, who sat frozen at the far end of the table. Rather than use the moment to distance himself from the two men who'd spent the morning overshadowing him, Marcus made a request that surprised almost everyone in the room. He asked that Bradley and Samuel remain part of the project rather than be dismissed entirely, framing it not as generosity but as simple practicality. Bradley would take charge of structuring the broader strategic framework, drawing on the market expertise that had defined his career. Samuel would lead the operational rollout of whatever changes came next, applying the same steady precision he'd shown throughout the meeting. Marcus would oversee the overall direction, making sure both pieces moved together rather than against each other. The decision told Margaret something even more important than the answer Marcus had given moments earlier. He wasn't simply better at spotting problems than the other two candidates, he was capable of turning former rivals into a working team, a skill far rarer than sharp analysis alone, and one that mattered just as much for the role she needed him to fill. Margaret's attention then shifted to Gordon, who had said nothing since Marcus's answer had reshaped the room. "You had this data for 3 years," she said, her voice quiet but unmistakably firm. "Marcus found it in a matter of hours. Explain to me why you didn't see it." Gordon opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. He looked down at the table for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice smaller than anyone in the room had heard before. He admitted he'd built the original model himself and had trusted it so completely that he'd stopped questioning whether the numbers underneath still told the same story. It wasn't a dramatic collapse, no shouting, no defense left to offer. It was simply a man forced to sit with the consequences of his own certainty in front of the very people who'd once trusted that certainty without question. Margaret didn't press further. She didn't need to. The admission itself had closed the matter as clearly as any punishment could have. In the weeks that followed, Marcus's work didn't begin on the 40th floor where the interview had taken place. It began instead in distribution centers and customer service departments, in the offices of mid-sized companies that had quietly kept Horizon afloat while the strategy above them had ignored their value entirely. He wanted to understand those clients directly, not through another internal report, but through actual conversations with the people running those businesses. Bradley and Samuel worked alongside him just as promised, rebuilding the strategy from its foundation rather than patching over the old one. Pricing structures were adjusted to reflect the segment actually driving revenue. Customer retention programs were redesigned around the accounts that had proven loyal for nearly 3 years. The rollout of new features shifted to prioritize the clients already invested in the product's success. Within a few quarters, Horizon returned to profitability for the first time since the losses began. A year later, it had become the fastest-growing division within Ashford Industries, a turnaround executives across the company referenced whenever a similar problem surfaced elsewhere. The transformation wasn't treated as a single dramatic event, but as proof that the right question asked at the right moment could change the direction of a multi-billion-dollar company. Margaret made changes far beyond Horizon in the months that followed. She overhauled the company's entire hiring process, requiring every candidate for a leadership position to be evaluated on demonstrated ability before any panel reviewed academic background, previous employers, or the length of a resume. It was a direct response to the morning she'd almost dismissed the one candidate who understood her company better than she did. On a quiet afternoon several months later, Marcus brought Zoe to the office for the first time. She walked through the lobby holding his hand, looking up at the tall windows and busy floors above with wide, curious eyes. When they reached his office, she noticed the same gray suit hanging on the back of his door, the one he still wore most days despite his new title. "Why haven't you bought a new suit yet?" Zoe asked, tilting her head the way she always did when something puzzled her. Marcus knelt slightly so he could look at her directly, the same way he had that morning months earlier when he'd fixed her hair before school. "Because this suit reminds me," he said, "that what someone is worth isn't decided by what people notice first. It's decided by what you prove once they finally listen." Zoe considered this for a moment, then simply nodded, satisfied with an answer she'd likely understand more fully as she got older. Marcus watched her walk toward the window to look out over the city, and for the first time in a long while, the weight he'd carried into that boardroom months earlier felt entirely gone. The story of that single interview eventually became something people at Ashford Industries repeated long after the details of Horizon's turnaround had faded into routine business history. It wasn't remembered simply as the moment a struggling project was saved, but as a reminder that judgment formed too quickly, based on a suit, a resume, or the color of someone's skin, could just as easily cost a company everything it valued most. Sometimes the person overlooked at the far end of the table is the only one who actually sees the truth the whole room has been avoiding. If this story reminded you not to judge someone before you've truly heard them out, that's really the whole point of telling it. If you enjoyed spending this time with Marcus's story, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and let us know in the comments what part stuck with you the most.